Well, welcome everyone. I hope that you're enjoying your All-American weekend, and for those who I've already interacted with either at the event we did this morning or the Global Scholars, great to see you again. For those who, for this is their first time today at SIS, delighted you could join us. For this very special event, I'm very grateful to the 4 alumni who've joined me today to talk about national security challenges and help us make sense, if we can, of the various things we're reading about in the news. And what I'm particularly appreciative of is that when I asked them each if they would participate on this panel for All-American Weekend, the responses were immediate and all positive, and I'm very grateful to them for that enthusiastic response. We are time constrained because we have to be done here at 3. You may have thought that as dean I would have some control over the space in this building, but the only way we were allowed to use this room today was because we promised the Development and Alumni Relations Office that we'd be out of here at 3, and 2 of us are heading to the airport. So let me just brief introductions of our panelists. I'll start down here at the end with Julie Smith, who is currently Director of Strategy and Statecraft Program at the Center for New American Security, was previously Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden, and before that served as Principal Director for European and NATO Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. And then to my immediate left is Kristin Lord, who as of next week will be the new President and CEO of IREX, International Research and Exchange. No, did I mess that up?
Like KFC now.
It's just called IREX? Okay. All right, it's just called IREX. All right. Or AARP. It's like AARP. All right.
No, not like AARP.
Kristin was most recently acting president and CEO of the United States Institute of Peace, and prior to that was at the Center for New American Security, Brookings, and the Elliott School, as well as at the State Department. Next to me on my right is Kelly Magsamen, who's Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. And prior to joining DOD, she served on the staff of the National Security Council, including as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Strategic Planning. Also at the NSF, also worked on Iran and other Middle East issues. And then finally, Jim Schear, who's currently Public Policy Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, was previously Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Partnership Strategy and Stability Operations, which meant he was involved in all of these very challenging problems, complex issues, natural disasters, post-conflict reconstruction issues, and he has been involved in a number of related issues, areas such as Cambodia and the Balkans earlier in his career. So again, delighted that they're here, and also delighted to welcome people who are watching on the live stream. I thought we'd start at sort of at a broad level before we drill down and just ask each of the panelists to reflect briefly on their thoughts on how to think about U.S. leadership in this changing world. You know, there's discussion about the United States as the indispensable nation, this notion that you know, the United States can't solve global problems on its own, but there's no global problem that can really be solved without the participation of the United States. And then, of course, we also have discussion about the United States being in decline, or the United States not being able to get its way as much as it did, for example, in the 1990s, and the rise of emerging powers that are challenging U.S. leadership, such as China, India, Brazil, and even other countries, Turkey, Indonesia, and so on. And you know, I think both of these things are true, and the question is sort of how do we think about what the United States is doing in the world, should be doing in the world, what are the things that maybe we don't see in the news that we should be thinking about, and we'll just start down here with Jim and work our way down the panel.
Thank you, Dean Goldgeier, and let me start with a big shout out to you and to SIS in general. This institution was a wonderful springboard for me going into a career in public policy, and I really value the time I was here. I should say in the early 70s, the tear gas had pretty much dissipated off of Ward Circle. Vietnam post the shootings out in Ohio, and there was a lot of tension, but we got through it, and it was a terrific learning experience for me. In terms of the leadership issue, you know, part of it, I think, is a challenge to for us to continue on a global orientation, dealing with some legacy problems. I have to say, looking at Russia and other cases, there's a back to the future quality in terms of what we're having to deal with. But I think there's also some opportunities for leadership to work constructively, U.S. leadership to work constructively with regional powers, to build what I would say are the regional pillars of global stability. I think on a regional level, there is a greater awareness than ever before that there are dependencies within regions that are forcing countries, the big powers, the small powers, to work more constructively together. And I think there are ways we can contribute to that without necessarily having to always be in the lead, to build a stabilizing architecture, if you will. And there are a number of countries out there, I call them the pay it forward crew, okay, right? They consumed security from others back in previous decades. Now they're in a better position to contribute. I mean, despite Ebola, Sierra Leone is getting ready to deploy into Somalia to help peacekeeping there. Colombia in Latin America still has issues on the Andean Ridge, but they are becoming more progressively contributors to local and regional stability. Brazil, after the earthquake in 2010, when I would go to Port-au-Prince, and the Brazilians just absolutely understood. They were leading the UN mission there. They had dealt with the favela issue in their own country. They knew that region a lot better than we did, frankly. And so I think there are opportunities to work with regional powers. So that's my initial thought.
Thanks. Kelly?
Well, also thank you for inviting me here. I'm very excited to be back at AU, my old stomping grounds, although last time I was here in Davenport Lounge looked a little bit different. So it's a lot nicer than it used to be. Well, let me take on the sort of U.S. aspect of leadership, because I sit in the government still. So I would say that I'm optimistic about American leadership, and I'll also take on the decline point, which is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine and my former boss, Tom Donilon. I think America is in a very strong position to continue to lead in this century. And I think the reason is not for what we used to think of traditional measurements of power. I mean, we still have the largest and most capable military in the world. We still have the largest economy in the world. It's really about our people and our human resources and human capital. And I think we have the most innovative economy in the entire world. We are investing in our people. Immigration actually is a good thing for the United States because it actually constantly renews us. We have a constant, as Americans, an ethos of renewal and constantly looking at how, evaluating ourselves and self-reflecting and how we can do better. And that's something that's actually quite unique to the United States. There are a lot of countries in the world that don't have that self-reflection. And I think that now more than ever, and even in this moment of complex, security environment and economic environment, I think the fact that as a country we reflect constantly on how we can do better in the world is something that's very important. Our energy future is tremendously powerful. It's going to be transformative, quite honestly, in this century. So I think, the United States will continue to be the foremost leader in the world. I think we have to be. I think there's a global demand signal for American leadership that's been sustained. I work on Asia Pacific, and I can tell you, I'm going there this afternoon, actually. There is a unceasing request for U.S. leadership, especially at a time right now where there feels a little chaotic in the world. And I also think that there is a hunger for some sort of organizing principle in the international system, which is something that I think we all, I have struggled with trying to find it. I know that many of my colleagues are also thinking a great deal about this. But I think, as Americans, we have an organizing principle of, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there's something similar on the international stage where we need an international system that can advance human liberty, human progress, security, and prosperity across the globe. And that's what we're looking for. I don't think there's an answer out there for what that organizing principle specifically looks like, but that's really, I think, the thrust of what is out there. So.
Great, thanks. Kristin.
Thanks, Jim. And I also want to say how happy I am to be here. You know, I went to school like everyone else, K through 12, but I always feel like my education really started at SIS. And I'm doubly grateful because not only did I get a great education, but I also met my husband, Jeff Lord, who's here today, also an SIS alum who has an international affairs career. So I owe a lot to SIS. I will actually continue along, surprisingly, will continue along the same path that Jim and Kelly set out on. This may be the only optimistic/positive foreign policy discussion you may hear in the last 6 months or the next 6 months. So, you know, I cherish this moment. But one of the things that really troubles me is that when I look at discussions of foreign policy, serious analyses of foreign policy, they seem consumed by threats and vulnerabilities. And don't get me wrong, those threats and vulnerabilities are real. And there are some very frightening things out there in the world today, and we need military means to confront them. We need partners to confront them. I mean, there are actors out there like ISIL that just reject every major international norm of warfare that's been established over the past many decades and even centuries. And so all of those things are real. But we would make a huge mistake to overemphasize those threats and to really abdicate the responsibility of American leadership that can be to lay out a positive agenda. And that positive agenda can include economic growth and investing in people through education, exchange, and business that we've done for so many years. This can be a bipartisan agenda. It's something that Eisenhower understood. It's something that Kennedy understood, is something that Reagan understood. But all too often when we look at our strategy documents, our public foreign policy speeches, they're all completely consumed with threats. But if we want to be powerful, if we want to be strong in the world, we'll put forward this positive agenda, and we're strong enough to do it, and we have the means to do it. So the question for me is, will we do it or not? And for the answer to that question, I turn to Julie.
Well, thanks, easy bit. Well, thanks, Jim, for the invitation to come back. I want to re-enroll. I want to come back to SIS and start all over. It's a beautiful building with amazing wealth of expertise and professors and students, and I love any chance I can get to come back to SIS. I agree with everything that's been said. Another optimist at heart. I don't think we're in decline. I can find plenty of reasons for us to feel very good about American leadership. But I do want to say something about how hard it is as a policymaker. And this is a very unique moment in history. It's extremely transformative. It's not the post-Cold War. It's not the post-9/11 era. It's something else. We don't know what it is. It's the post-post something. We're still trying to put our finger on it. But it has certain attributes that make it very hard for those in government to navigate this question of American leadership. And I think on the pull side of pulling you back and away from American leadership, you've got a very schizophrenic kind of public opinion source of data that's coming into you daily saying, don't lead so much, don't spend so much money, we have domestic concerns here at home, a long list of things. We spent a lot on Iraq and Afghanistan, some questions about the utility of the use of force. And so you get these mixed signals from the American public all the time. On top of it, you know they're right, partly, that there are a lot of domestic concerns that demand the president's attention, that we don't have the same level of resourcing that we once did, and that we now share the world stage with a whole host of other actors. It doesn't mean we're in decline, it's just our share on the global stage might be a little trimmer in some cases in various international institutions. But on the pull side, pulling us towards American leadership is this constant refrain from allies and partners and friends around the world that say, please help us, you build the coalition. When you come forward and put the team together, whether it's on Ebola or ISIL or Ukraine, others will follow. And we've tried hard to kind of nudge our favorite partners, and Jim's right, some of them really surprise us and punch above their weight, and a lot of them don't. And they do when we are behind them, nudging them, or we step forward first. And so it's this constant push and pull, yin-yang. When you're in government, you understand there's a lot going on, there are lots of other challenges for you to focus on, and that the president does have a domestic agenda that's quite rich and demanding, and the public is right to question how we allocate our resources. But at the same time, you're trying to constantly exhibit that leadership and be the first country that steps forward and provide that unique set of leadership. We are in many ways the country that can help deal with the fraying liberal order and the fact that this alphabet soup of international institutions that we've spent so hard creating need a lot of reform right now. We're the only country in many ways that can cope with some of the technological challenges that we're seeing in the world, that we've got the capacity there and the innovation. And so there is a uniqueness to the way in which we lead, how we go about it. And again, I can just say from my time in government, and I know my colleagues that are still in, and Kelly and others, do grapple with this from time to time. And I think we shouldn't make light of it, that it does pull you in different directions throughout your tenure.
Great. Thank you guys for getting us started. And so I'm going to work my way back down this way. And Julie, ask you to reflect on a little bit more on the role of our allies, especially our European allies with whom you've worked so much. What kinds of expectations should we have about the role they can play, and perhaps put it in the context of the crisis in Ukraine? Are there things that either have surprised you that they've done, or things that you think that they still should be doing more of, given that it's a conflict that is in their backyard as opposed to ours?
Well, so there's been kind of three objectives for the administration. On the Ukraine crisis, you want to keep pressure on the Russians and prevent Russia or Putin from taking this any further, and try and obviously prevent an escalation of the violence in eastern Ukraine and get him out of there, and the troops and all the rest. You want to support Poroshenko and Kiev as best you can, and then you want to reassure the very skittish allies that are just on the periphery, whether they're in the NATO alliance or just outside NATO's borders, countries like Georgia and Moldova. And I think in terms of our allies, there have been moments where the U.S. has been surprised and disappointed. I think there have been moments where we've been pleasantly surprised by their actions and willing to step forward. But again, this brings me back to the point I just made. It really has been the White House forming the coalition on all three fronts that has succeeded in moving forward with the sanctions against Russia. I would really credit U.S. leadership a great deal on this. On supporting Kiev, here the Europeans have been stronger. Certain countries, Poland in particular, Sweden and others, have played very important roles. But again, many of them needed a bit of a nudge from the United States. And then on the reassuring our allies, Obama stepped forward with this $1 billion pledge for European security, and I think it challenged the Europeans after years of declining defense budgets to stop and think and say, gee, what are the fundamental consequences of us doing this for the last decade plus, and do we need to stop the bleeding or reverse course and slowly increase defense spending? And we've seen some instances where now there are actual real results, countries deciding to go the other way and invest in their defense capabilities should Putin do something really rash. Unfortunately, what we haven't all done very well is prepare for not necessarily some sort of conventional war. We're struggling to figure out how to deal with everything that Putin might do just below the threshold, and that's of an Article 5 attack. And that's where I think both the United States and Europe are struggling right now, trying to figure out how do you deal with this asymmetric piece of it. And this will be a long-standing challenge. But again, I think the United States is going to have to provide some of the answers and lead a coalition in tackling that. I just wanted to quickly share an anecdote that for me just kind of sums up how you deal with our allies sometimes and how complicated it is. So I worked for Secretary Gates and Secretary Panetta at the Pentagon. Gates had a very aggressive approach on European defense spending, like to be the finger in the eye and say, you guys need to pull your socks up and spend more. And he gave this, you may remember this speech before he left office in Brussels that was pretty harsh on the Europeans, pretty honest and frank. And it ruffled a lot of feathers, and Europeans said, gee, you kind of blasted us. That wasn't very nice, and you didn't have to do it so publicly. Then Secretary Panetta arrives and says, I'm the son of an Italian immigrant. I handle things differently. Publicly, I'm not going to poke anyone in the eye. Behind closed doors, we'll talk about declining defense budgets. So he, goes about his business of quietly talking to Europeans about their defense spending. And then months later into his tenure, we start getting knocks at the door, and the Europeans are saying, why aren't you beating up on us anymore? We really need that. We need the, and then you're just rubbing your eyes in disbelief thinking, wait, you didn't want Secretary Gates. Secretary Gates was too harsh. Secretary Panetta now is what, too light on you guys? So just to give you a sense of dealing with allies, it's, not that we're not in the same boat at times, but there can be an element of schizophrenia in dealing with it all.
Can I just stay for a minute on Ukraine and just sort of explain to everybody here in the room and who's ever watching why they should care about what's happening in Ukraine? What does it matter to the United States?
Oh, what, me? Oh, I thought
Yes,
you were,
you.
oh, sure.
You.
Why
I
do
mean,
we
I have
care
my
about-
own
yeah,
answer,
yeah,
but I want to
yeah,
hear
yeah.
yours. So.
No, we care deeply about this. I mean, but let's be realistic. I mean, in terms of direct national security interests, I'm not going to tell you that Ukraine outranks everything else in the world. And I still think Asia is very much the beating heart of everything the United States should be focused on right now. It's not just a tip of the hat towards Kelly, but she can tell you the same thing. But if I think about, okay, ISIL, if I think about what's going on in the Middle East, if I think about Gaza, if I think about Iraq right now, Syria, I mean, there are all sorts of crises that are burning that you can think this could potentially either already has a direct impact on our national security or soon will. And you can't necessarily put Ukraine in that category, but I still rank it very high because of what it says about the international system, about Putin violating the rules of the game that we've spent so long building up and agreeing upon, and we can't let him get away with this. At the same time, we have to be clear-eyed about the fact that we need Russia to work with us. We have to work with them on ISIL. We've got to work with them in Syria. We've got to work with them on Iran, and the list goes on and on. And so we can't necessarily say, well, we'll just isolate you forever and do absolutely nothing with Moscow ever again and be quite rash about it. But at the same time, there has to be a concerted international movement to say this will not stand. And we're not going to let you continue to take inch by inch a little bit of territory here and there. You can't just show up and annex somebody else's territory. And so that's important for the principle, for what it says about the international order, for what it says about our security commitments in Europe. We don't have a formal security commitment to Ukraine, but one has to wonder, what types of commitments we have loosely to these countries that we've worked so hard to help them move towards the West over the last 20 plus years. So it's complicated, it's not ISIL, but I would argue it's very important.
Since you mentioned Asia, I'm going to turn to Kelly. And and she also had mentioned before her former boss, Tom Donilon, former national security advisor, who was so instrumental in the way in which we think about the United States foreign policy and making the case that we, had so much focus and so many assets in Europe and the Middle East, and that given the rise of Asia, that we needed to rebalance American foreign policy and address the rise of Asia and give that a higher priority than it had with all the attention on Europe and the Middle East. We've heard a lot about the rebalance to Asia, and yet, every time we start to talk about it, we get something like ISIL or Ebola, and then we don't hear that much about Asia. So did we or are we rebalancing to Asia, and what does that mean given that we, especially with the Middle East, we can't seem to escape?
I agree with that. Well, I have to say that I am actually the personal embodiment of the rebalance. I was a Middle East expert for most of my career until about a year ago, and now I'm doing Asia. So I feel like I'm actually rebalancing at least. It's a tough question, and I think there's a lot of misperception about kind of what the rebalance is about. It was about looking at where we were underinvested in the world, and that was a deliberate exercise we went through at the beginning of the administration. But it's also a long-term strategy, quite honestly. It's about a long-term strategic investment. The future of all of our, economic growth and security is going to be driven by Asia in the next century. So I think there's a recognition across the government that we need to be investing more in Asia. But does it mean that we're leaving Europe or our allies in Europe, or not focusing on the crises in the Middle East? No, I mean, we're a global power. We have to act globally. We have global responsibilities. But I will say, on the importance of what we're doing in Asia, it's all goes back to this rules-based order, and that's something that Julie mentioned in terms of the Ukraine piece, and it's relevant in Asia too. We worked for decades, 70 years, to put in place economic and security rules of the road in Asia that, frankly, is led to the growth of Asia, even led to and supported the growth of China. So there are countries that are deeply invested in this order that we, as America, helped put in place after World War II. Now it's about making sure that the rules of the road are followed. We have a rising China, as you know, and it's about shaping China's rise to ensure they play by the rules. On the security side of the order, we are taking time to invest in all of our alliances, Japan, Korea, those two alliances actually we're spending a lot of time on right now, updating them and modernizing them, frankly, to deal with the kind of global challenges that we have. People tend to forget that our Asian allies are actually global allies for us. Australians have fought in every war, I think, since the last 100 years with us. The Koreans and the Japanese contributed in Afghanistan and Iraq. So these alliances are critical to our global security. So it's not about just keeping Asia in Asia. I mean, Asia is global. It's something to keep in mind. But it's also, about investing in new partners, and rising partners like Indonesia and Malaysia. Southeast Asia, the middle class in Southeast Asia is going to double, I think. I'm probably going to get the statistic wrong, so don't quote me. But double, I think, in the next 20 years. That's significant. That's going to drive a lot of growth. So we are taking time to invest in those partners. Or taking time to invest in the institutional infrastructure of Asia, like ASEAN, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, if people don't know. That is an affirmative investment that the United States is making, both on the economic and political side, but also on the security side. But engaging in Asia is more than just, allies, partners. It's about personal engagement. Secretary Hagel, my boss, has been there, I think, 6 times since he's been Secretary of Defense, which I think is the most that any Secretary of Defense has ever gone. So it is, significant. You have to invest time in it. It's far away. Trust me, I have a 20-hour flight ahead of me this afternoon. But, it's important that the United States continue, even as these crises are going on in the Middle East or elsewhere, to make time for some of these relationships. But even, on the security side, we're increasing our, Navy and Air Force presence in Asia. But also on the economic side, TPP, which the Trans-Pacific Partnership that's being worked on right now, that's going to capture, I think it's 85% of global GDP. That is huge. That's economic rules of the road that we, the United States, are leading in Asia. So I would say that even as all this is going on in the Middle East, Ebola on the news, that Asia is still something that we are investing in deeply, and it may not make the headlines, and it may not be on CNN every morning, but it's underway, and it's going to be a long-term effort, and it's going to be a long-term effort across our government, not just defense, but economic and diplomatic.
Great, thank you. All right, so we're having this conversation about rules-based order, and we have ISIL. So what do we do about a group like ISIL? Do you believe, Kristin, that ISIL is a threat of the magnitude that has drawn this current response from the United States to lead a coalition and carry out airstrikes against it? And what kind of outcome should we hope to see, over the long? We've been warned that this is going to take many years to address. How do we make sense of something like ISIL?
Thanks for the softball, Joe.
Yeah.
I do think ISIL is a serious threat. These are people that Al-Qaeda thought were too violent to deal with, too extreme to deal with. They're just wreaking havoc on civilian lives across Iraq and parts of Syria. More than 200,000 people have died in Syria, by the way. We seem to lose sight of this, and ISIL is one piece of it, but also ISIL's existence continues to allow Assad to perpetrate this incredible humanitarian disaster. I mean, I do think there is some chance that this is a group that will export violence, terrorism to Europe, to other states in the region, potentially to the United States. So it is a threat. It's a humanitarian catastrophe, first and foremost. It is a severe security threat to states in the region, and it is a security threat to the United States in some respects, and certainly to U.S. facilities in the region. What should the United States do? It's a very difficult question, because I think the issue here is the United States is not prepared to go to war, in a major ground war, to defeat ISIL. The public is not behind it. I think it could be counterproductive in the region. Well, on the other hand, everyone feels that we need to do something. And I don't think this is a vacant call. You know, it's not just an urge to do something. There's a real set of humanitarian security concerns here. So the issue then is what to do. And I think the answer, while not claiming to have the perfect answer, because there isn't one here, is to work with states in the region who have far more at stake than we do, and to support their efforts and to encourage them to work together. Like Julie was saying, sometimes what the United States can do most effectively is to nudge players in the right direction. And one of the problems in countering ISIL is that a lot of the states in the region are actually at odds with each other right now, even as they have a common threat in ISIL. So anything we can do to help those states take the lead and work together more effectively is good work. The other thing to do is to contain ISIL, to keep it from spreading across the border into Turkey, further into Syria, further into Iraq. I mean, that's certainly another issue there. A third issue is the humanitarian situation. I mean, really, that this is an extremely destructive group that abides by no norms of international behavior that have been established over decades and centuries, as I said before. And anything we can do to alleviate the suffering, to protect civilians in these areas, you know, I think deserves serious action. But I think we ought to also face facts that this is not a war that the United States can or should go into and hope to be effective in terms of a massive ground war. But we somehow have to strike a balance here, and that's going to be the tough part. Not spending too much, not devoting too much, but still having some effect. And it's not just going to be up to us.
So Jim, the other big thing in the news is, of course, Ebola. And you've been involved since the 90s in lots of different kinds of operations that the United States has participated in, the situations in the Balkans in the 1990s, natural disasters, all sorts of different types of things that face the United States, and for which, in some cases, the United States military had thought about addressing. In other cases, the military was asked to do something about them. What's the role today for the United States military, or the U.S. more broadly, in trying to combat Ebola? How do we go about helping address the situation?
Great question, and it is always a challenge to involve civilian and military actors in a constructive way on a multifaceted crisis. And I would have to say that Ebola as an epidemic, I wouldn't say pandemic, but certainly one that brings to the fore a lot of these issues. The very first question that anyone in the Pentagon will ask when the phone goes off at 2 in the morning, which it does, is sort of what's the constructive division of labor between DOD and civilian relief providers. DOD has statutory authority to provide foreign disaster relief. It's there, it's budgeted, not always very well, that's a longer story, but it does have a role, and it has played a hugely significant role over time, over the last 40 or 50 years, going back to the Berlin airlift in the middle of the Cold War. And it has a deeply embedded capacity, whether it's medical workers in the military medical community, engineers who can rebuild bridges or build treatment centers in this case, aircraft and ships to lift things in. So deeply embedded capacity, but it's also, and it will always say this right up front, it's not a disaster relief agency, okay? It may be called away in 24 hours to do a bombing campaign somewhere, and it won't be around. So that has to be borne in mind. Right now, I would say, in West Africa, there has been a fairly well-developed plan of action to deal with the treatment issue and, to a degree, the containment of the transmission problem. DoD is providing logistics support. There is an air hub in Senegal which is being created to stage through critical supplies. DoD will be is building 17 Ebola treatment units and providing the materials or supporting the provision of the materials in for that. It is also building a treatment center in Monrovia for healthcare workers, which will be really important to keep international healthcare workers, who are volunteers, by the way, they're not drafted into it, engaged in this process. And it will also handle a lot of the management on the non-medical side. For the civilian side, absolutely the lead in terms of the medical provision of medical care, medical support, and there'll be a lot of engagement both about how the materials gets in and the training. There'll be a boot camp for local medical personnel to deal with this personal protective gear that everyone has to wear and to be utilized in the treatment center. So that's going forward. Is it enough? Too soon to say. The CDC estimates are of concern. I would have to say, though, that thus far Ebola, in terms of ranking of other epidemics, pandemics, isn't quite up there yet. Let's remember the Spanish flu of 1918. Hundreds of millions of people died. I mean, that was World War I. That was soldiers coming back from the front with the transmissions globally. So we're not at that stage yet. But I would say there's certainly a great amount of angst because of what happened in Texas. I would say even yesterday, a woman going into the Pentagon had a problem and threw up and said she had been in Africa. And so that got things.
She did not have Ebola.
She did not have Ebola. She was cleared of that. Okay, just to be clear.
No panic.
Absolutely. But it gives you an indication of how concerning this is to us. But so there is a civ-mil division of labor that's constructive. Whether it's sufficient is still an open question.
Well, I want to make sure that we give folks here a chance to ask questions that are on your mind, and so if there's anything you'd be interested in asking, please. Yes, do we have a microphone? Yeah, we have somebody right here, Cara. Right up here.
Oh, right.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to collect a couple questions. So we've got her, and then we've got the gentleman right over there. Okay.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm a freshman student here at SIS, but I guess my question is, some might argue that, at least from a realist perspective, the United States is hesitant to get involved in foreign issues when they don't have a more selfish national interest to fulfill. Would you agree with the statement? Why or why not?
Great. You taking Bosco's World Politics?
No, I'm actually with Professor Prasad.
Oh, great, good. All right, excellent. And then we have one right over here.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here as a guest. I have, I guess, a question or issue which I'd like to get your opinions on in terms of, for lack of a better expression, truth to power regarding our invasion of Iraq. How can we show the world on the world stage that the United States is a credible nation and therefore try to denounce Vladimir Putin's invasion of the Ukraine? Has our confidence in the world been undermined because of Iraq? And secondly, will that undermining of confidence, if it exists, and I'd like to know, in your opinion, if it does, I think it does, will that lend itself into economic spheres such as the Chinese yuan replacing the United States dollar as an international monetary standard?
Great, thanks. And I think there was one more. There was somebody, yeah. We just passed that back to us.
If you compare the situation we face in terms of ISIS and compare that to the Cold War, there's a great deal of depth and breadth to the way President Kennedy pursued the Cold War, and it was not just military. Our response included the Peace Corps, Partnership for Peace, Partnership for Progress, cultural exchanges. I don't see that depth and breadth in our response to this threat. And my question is, do you see it, or do you see a place for that, or is this a threat that is so different that that kind of engagement with the other forces is appropriate or not?
All right, we got realism, we've got Iraq and Russia, and we've got depth and breadth. Who wants to start? You raising your hand?
I'll
over
try.
there? All right.
Yes. Truth to power. I think post-Iraq there is a very strong focus within government on the part of leaders to make sure they're not just hearing happy talk. I mean, I have to say the number of times that Secretary Gates would turn to a senior military officer and say, I didn't hear that right, indicates that. Now, bureaucratically, there are always interesting dynamics. I would go in when I was a researcher at the National Defense University. If I told a general officer, I've looked at everything you're doing, sir, and I totally agree with the conventional wisdom here about what you're doing. It works. He would stare at me very skeptically. His staff would love me, but he would be skeptical. On the other hand, if I went in and say, sir, I've looked at this and there are some real problems. This policy isn't going to work, and here are the 5 reasons. He would be he and she, by the way, would be very interested in that, but the staff would not love me. So there are always those dynamics in terms of the truth to power problem. I think on Iraq, Saddam was Saddam, and I think that a lot of people aren't unhappy that he's gone. The problem was the day after, and we really did not prepare well. We had a plan, a notion, but it fell apart, and I think we could have done a lot better in terms of anticipating that and understanding the cultural terrain mapping of the area, which wasn't done very well. But that's key. On the realism, offshore balancing is great, and a lot of my realist friends or academics said offshore balancing, but onshore stabilization is still there, and it's not going to go away. But the answer to that goes to the third question, I think, which is the soft power issue. I mean, one thing that I think we don't give enough credit for is the extent to which education, U.S. education, at the college and university level, including here, has become a terrific tool, instrument for soft power. I spent a lot of time in countries working on ministerial level development in the security sector, and I had so many sort of interlocutors who had been educated in the U.S. or Europe, and very pragmatic, very willing to work. It wasn't always that case. I don't want to sort of overgeneralize, but there were many, many opportunities to have good, constructive dialogue, and I think that educational, the diasporas plural, has really had a very positive soft power impact. So I favor sort of adroit onshore stabilization.
Hey, Kelly, can I ask you to comment on the depth and breadth question and sort of how the range of activities that we engage in as we pursue our foreign policy?
Yeah. Well, actually, I'll sort of pick up on that, but I also want to do the realist question, in part because this is something I've never figured out as an international studies person. There's the realists and the liberalists and liberal internationalists and the neoliberal internationalists and you pick your school of thought. What I can say as a practitioner of foreign policy is that the United States doesn't have the luxury of just being realist. Do we act in our interests, our national security interests? Absolutely. Should we? Yes, absolutely. At the same time, though, we have a collective stake in this order that we have built. And, the United States, unlike China, we're not China, and other partners know that, right? So China will come in and they'll invest billions of dollars in Africa and in infrastructure, et cetera. But the United States comes in and works to help build, infrastructure that lasts, or helps build, the labor class, or, we do a little bit of a different kind of leadership in the world, which I think is important. It's just qualitatively different. We believe in the importance of values and human rights and things like that. So I always get teed off on realist, solely realist foreign policy, which is something I don't think that as Americans we're wired to do. There's something different about how we execute foreign policy around the world. And then the depth and breadth question was,
well,
how
just
big?
Well, just, I mean, there are all sorts of elements of the foreign policy that aren't military, and how do we ensure that we've got a broad-based foreign policy that takes advantages of, you know, in many cases of the kind of human resources that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, one thing is we have to constantly ask ourselves the question of what tools are we using to solve the problem? And what, you know, if there is a challenge like ISIS or if there is a challenge like Ebola, I think it's important to step back and say, you know, eventually what is going to actually solve the problem in the end game, and look across the government and then make the right investments in those areas. So, for example, ISIS, I'll do briefly a comment. I don't do Middle East anymore, so I have to be careful. But it's, you know, it's not going to be solved purely through military tools. It's going to be solved through building correct governance in Iraq. It's going to be solved through addressing the humanitarian crisis, using NGOs and cooperating with international organizations to do that. So it's not about how many F-18s you fly off an aircraft carrier. Ultimately, the solution to that problem is going to be one that requires, you know, soft power, hard power, international organizations, regional institutions. Oh, by the way, you know, Asian partners, because there's challenges with potentially ISIS coming to Asia. So, you know, it's not just a response. It's going to be a regional response. It's going to be a global response.
Great. And Kristin, can I ask you, just with respect to institutions where you've been, like the U.S. Institute of Peace, and now you're moving over to IREX, what's the role of those institutions as we think about the depth and breadth question?
And do you mind if I tie it to the
Please.
two specific
Yeah,
questions? On the issue of credibility, of course, credibility matters in international politics. It matters, period. That said, I think this argument can be overstated. And as a result, presidents have to be very careful that when they only say they're going to do something when they really will do something about it, and when they say they're going to do it, that they do it. But the other reason the credibility arguments are overstated is they tend to assume that everyone in the world acts based on what the U.S. is or is not going to do. And I actually think the truth of the world these days is that people don't get up every day and factor every decision or calculation they make looking through the lens of the United States and U.S. power. That's probably a good thing in many respects, a very healthy thing, but it also means that we have to change our own thinking about how to adjust. And that gets to the issue of soft power. A mutual friend of Jim's and mine wrote a piece yesterday when he said, yes, ISIL is a serious and real threat, but what are the other 400 million people in the Middle East doing? It's a great question, and you know, maybe we should be investing a little bit more and focusing a little bit more on helping the people who will transform these regions positively through the inside, through peaceful means, rather than only focusing on the military instrument where we may just be playing whack-a-mole.
Right.
Oh, and IREX can play a huge role in this. I encourage you to look at the website and donate generously.
SAS comes first, no offense. But of course, many of these people, you know, it's like I was telling at the town hall earlier, and I have two kids in college. I always love getting the letters from both of their universities asking for my support, and I always think, but I just wrote the tuition check. I mean, you really. So for those of you who are getting those letters from American University, don't throw them out. But I understand what your reaction probably is when you get them.
Well, on the realism point, I would just second what Kelly said. I mean, I think from a practitioner's point of view, it's just very hard to box yourself in. You might have certain instincts. I think presidents come in with preferences but find themselves pulled out of those narrow lanes despite their best efforts for lots of reasons. I guess I'll just say something quickly about the depth and breadth. I mean, I do think that for this government, but for the last couple of administrations as well, this kind of tagline, this bumper sticker of a whole of government approach is rooted in fact. I think when you sit in meetings, interagency meetings, whether at the highest levels in the Situation Room or at lower levels at the Action Officer, you find increasingly colleagues from all sorts of agencies that you can't even imagine. I mean, DOD meeting with not just state, but Treasury and Commerce and AID and Energy, whoever might be involved in any particular crisis. And so you see that effort is kind of built in now. We don't always succeed. We don't always do it well. well. There are lots of instances where we wring our hands, wish we would have done it better. We haven't done a great job of, building up some huge civilian response corps. You'll remember Secretary Gates and Secretary Clinton were out trying to make the case, invest more. We didn't really succeed in terms of moving resources, and I guess that's my second point is despite our best efforts, there are problems. There are problems in bringing in some lesser funded agencies because they just don't have the resources and the capabilities, frankly, that they deserve. And that's our ongoing challenge in educating Congress, educating the American public, but also to the extent that we do succeed on this front, it just doesn't make the front page of the New York Times or, NBC Nightly News or Twitter or whatever, because it's, 100 election observers going into Ukraine. It's not the same as that shot of the F-18, taking off somewhere. And that's the sad reality is that the sex appeal of some of the things we're doing on the other fronts just don't get the love and affection they deserve, either, as I noted, on the resourcing side or when we do get the resources, just in publicly acknowledging them. So it's not easy, but I think if you read the national security strategy that the administration put out in the first term, there's a heavy focus on this, and I think the next version, which I hear is due out perhaps before the end of the year, you'll see another heavy emphasis on this whole of government approach.
Any other questions from anybody out here? Yeah, we got a couple. So we'll make these the two last questions and any answers from up here. We're right over here. Yeah.
Thank you. In terms of the Ebola crisis, I was wondering what your opinions might be on the emerging controversy of the political correctness of travel bans and travel restrictions.
Mm-hmm. And then we've got the gentleman in a check shirt there.
One of the overarching themes that I heard before we started taking questions was the rule of norms and the way that the United States has played a large part in establishing them. But what we have now is groups like ISIL who don't participate in those norms, and China and Russia who also are sort of making their own path. So how is it that the United States can deal with so many different groups who are not participating in the norms that have been established, but they all participate in different ways?
Right, and I thought I saw one more hand in the way back. Yeah, Kara, do you want to just take the mic back there? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Aaron. I'm a senior in SPA. I just wanted to ask our Asia expert, Kelly, about Modi, Narendra Modi, who just became Prime Minister of India, a transformational figure in India, and actually even came to Madison Square Garden and engaged, I think, 20,000 Indian Americans, but is very controversial in his record of human rights and how he treats Muslims in India and around the region. How do you think the administration and U.S. foreign policy going forward is going to look at him and engage him?
Why don't we start with that one, especially since I'm flying to New Delhi tonight. I'd be interested, particularly interested to hear about your views on Mr. Modi.
Okay, sure. I think you're right. You used the right word, transformational. I think he is going to be a transformational figure. He was in Washington and New York in September. He saw the president while he was here. He saw my Secretary of Defense. I think what India is obviously a hugely important economic power in the region and globally, and also that they play a major role in the security sphere in South Asia and beyond. Our perspective on them is that it's important to understand the rise of India as well in the context of Asia. I think Modi is driving a much more look east policy. So he's, not to speak for him, but obviously there are major trends evolving in Asia. China is rising, and I think Modi is looking up and saying, okay, what does this mean for India? So you'll see, I think, a much more East-driven foreign policy from the Indians. That's something that actually we encourage because, India is a democratic power. We have a lot in common, and we think that that is an important contribution that can be made to the Asian security sphere. So, on the defense side, we're building out a much more robust defense relationship with them. trying to cooperate on issues like maritime security. If you think about the Indian Ocean, for example, tons of trade and commerce go through the Indian Ocean. That's something that both the United States and India have a common interest in protecting. So it's we're very excited. We think it's a positive development for the region. I can't personally comment on the human rights piece, but I can tell you that we engage all countries on human rights issues, no matter who they are. So that's something, again, back to the American foreign policy perspective, that's something that we do as Americans.
Great, thanks. Kristin, you want to say something about the norms issue?
Sure. First of all, I wouldn't lump the normative challenges from ISIL and China and Russia all in the same categories. I think they're very, very different. Personally, I'm not so worried that we're going to lose the war of ideals to ISIL. This is not an ideology that's popular even among Muslim populations worldwide. We're not going to lose a war of ideas to ISIL. That said, I think what we can do is to first do no harm. Don't avoid doing things that drive people into the arms of ISIL, even though they don't support them. So for instance, what can we do to make sure that Sunnis in Iraq actually fight against ISIL instead of cooperating with them? And that means that we need to do some things working with our Iraqi partners. We also need to be careful that we don't, in attacking ISIL, inflict a lot of civilian casualties that, again, will drive people into their arms. So there is, I think, a first do no harm strategy. With the Chinese, there I think we need to be a little bit self-reflective and say, why has the Chinese model been attractive? And one of the reasons is they've been tremendously successful at lifting massive numbers of people out of poverty. It is understandable why that is appealing. So what can we do in that respect? I'd say show, don't tell. What can we show the world about other models that can also lift people out of poverty that might not have the same negative consequences? And we can also see that people who are benefiting from Chinese economic growth also don't like other elements of the system. Just look at Hong Kong. The economic growth is not enough for people. So do we stand up and support people who are standing up for political values that we stand for as well? I mean, I think that's where we can play a positive role without standing behind a podium and lecturing to the world about the right ways to do something. Let's look at why the Chinese model is actually attractive. And I don't think the Russian model is hugely attractive either, so I'm not worried about them.
And 30 seconds on travel ban, either Julie or Jim. Do you have a...
I'm not in favor of the travel ban. I think it would terribly restrict our ability to flow capacity and expertise into West Africa. There are some internal migration issues in West Africa we have to look closely at, including youth migration in terms of jobs at various times of the season. So the movement within West Africa and Central Africa will be something of concern.
Well,
I can give a brief anecdote if that's helpful, Jim. I just got back from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and every time I crossed the border, I was scanned and had my temperature taken. I felt like if the Congolese can manage to have travel across their border and measure and monitor the health, the spread of the disease, that we can probably manage to do that as well.
Great. Well, one of the reasons I was so excited to have these four with us, not just to show off the things that our great alumni are doing, but also to demonstrate that, when people think of SIS, a lot of times they think about all the great work that our alumni are doing, and they are doing great work in the areas of development and non-military, non-security issues. And we do have, as you can see, such distinguished alumni who are working in the national security sphere as well. So it's very exciting for me to be able to welcome them back to campus. We have lots of events all the time here at SIS, so I encourage you, parents and others with your students this weekend, to ask them about the events that they've been going to, and also encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. Follow us on Facebook or Twitter to keep track of the events, because you can watch them over the live stream or the video that we put up on the website later, so you can get a little bit of a sense of the kinds of opportunities that are available to our students. But again, thank you so much to our alumni for coming back, and wish you also great things for all the important work that you all are doing. And thank you all very much, and hope you have a great rest of your All-American weekend.
Have a good trip. Sure, quick picture. Okay.